A Sherlock Holmes sleep mystery for Tuck and Tales. Good evening. And welcome to Tuck and Tales, a quiet place at the edge of the night, where the fire burns low, where the rain moves softly against the windows, and where every story is told slowly enough to let the world grow still. Tonight, we return to old London, to the foggy streets, the glowing lamps, the wet cobblestones, and the familiar rooms of 221B Baker Street. It is there, beside the fireplace, that Dr. John Watson remembers one of Sherlock Holmes's strangest and most delicate cases. A case of music heard after midnight, a case of a vanished violinist, a case of a locked theater, a silver tuning key, and a melody that seemed to come from nowhere. So settle in now. Let the room around you become quiet. Pull the blankets a little closer and allow the soft rain of London to carry you gently into the story. Tonight's tale is called The Case of the Midnight Violin. These are the stories that tuck you in. It was on a wet October evening, during one of those London rains that seems not to fall from the sky but to rise out of the very stones, that Sherlock Holmes first heard of the Midnight Violin. The matter came to us shortly after dinner. I remember the evening clearly, for Holmes had been unusually silent since breakfast. He sat armchair beside the fire, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes half closed, and his pipe resting untouched on the small table at his side. The room was warm, but the city beyond our windows was cold and restless. Rain tapped against the glass. The lamps along Baker Street glowed dimly through the fog. Now and again, the wheels of a passing cab hissed over the wet road below. I had spent most of the evening reading a medical journal, though I confess the article before me had failed to hold my attention. There are nights when Baker Street itself becomes more interesting than any printed page. The shifting firelight, the smell of tobacco and old books, the distant sounds of London, and Holmes sitting in silence, like some watchful bird of prey, all combined to create the impression that something was waiting to happen. At last I laid my journal upon my knee. "You are troubled tonight, Holmes." "Am I? You have not touched your pipe?" "That is observation, Watson, not diagnosis. I have learned something from living here." "Indeed, you have learned when I have not touched my pipe." He spoke mildly, but there was a faint smile in his voice. I leaned back in my chair. "Then you are not troubled?" "I am understimulated, which is worse. At least trouble has a subject." "Precisely." He opened his eyes and looked toward the window, where rain moved in silver lines down the glass. "London contains 4 million souls, Watson, and on some evenings not one of them can arrange a puzzle worth the price of a cab fare." "You are severe." "I am accurate. Most crimes are dreary. A jealous husband, a forged signature, a servant with a duplicate key, a gentleman who does not wish his wife to learn where he spent Thursday evening. These are not mysteries. They are disappointments wearing hats." I laughed. "And yet you solve them. When necessary, a man must eat." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded upon the stairs, followed by a gentle knock at the door. "Come in," said Holmes. Our landlady entered, carrying a silver tray upon which lay a card and a sealed note. "A gentleman has called, Mr. Holmes." "At this hour?" "He says the matter is urgent." "They always do. He also says it concerns a violin." Holmes, who had not moved for the better part of an hour, turned his head at once. "A violin?" "Yes, sir." "His card?" Mrs. Hudson handed it to him. Holmes read the name aloud. "Mr. Edwin Larkspur, manager of the Arcadia Theatre, Wych Street." I saw his expression sharpen. "The Arcadia," he murmured, "closed these 10 years, unless I am mistaken." "You are not," said Mrs. Hudson. "The gentleman looks as though he has not slept in several nights." "A promising symptom," said Holmes. "Show him up." Mrs. Hudson withdrew. Holmes handed me the card. "The Arcadia Theatre," I said. "I believe I once attended a comic opera there before my marriage. A rather handsome building, though somewhat old-fashioned. Built in 1841. Renovated in 1868. Closed after a fire scare in 1879. Reopened briefly. Failed, and has stood largely unused since. You know a great deal about theaters for a man who claims not to enjoy them. I enjoy architecture. It is more honest than acting." Before I could reply, footsteps approached the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a thin gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with a narrow face, damp gray hair, and a black coat that seemed too fine for the weather and too worn for pride. He held his hat in both hands and looked from Holmes to me with the uncertain expression of a man who feared he would not be believed. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes indicated the chair opposite him. "Pray sit down, Mr. Larkspur. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely before him." Mr. Larkspur sat, though his posture suggested that he might spring up again at the slightest provocation. "I hardly know where to begin." "At the beginning is customary," said Holmes. "But if the beginning is obscure, begin with what frightened you most." The man swallowed. "Every night for the past week a violin has been playing inside my theater." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Inside the Arcadia?" "Yes." "At what hour?" "Midnight." "Precisely?" "Within a minute or two." "And who plays it?" Mr. Larkspur looked down at his hat. "That is the difficulty, Mr. Holmes. There is no one inside." Holmes leaned back. "Excellent. Continue." Mr. Larkspur blinked. "Excellent? From my perspective, yes. From yours, I presume less so. You have searched the premises? Every room, every corridor, every box, every passage beneath the stage." "Who searched?" "Myself, Mr. Finch, the caretaker, and once a constable from Bow Street." "And still the violin played?" "Yes." "From where?" "That is the strange part. Sometimes from the stage, sometimes from the gallery, twice from the locked dressing room of a dead man." I felt a slight chill despite the fire. Holmes reached for his pipe but did not light it. "A dead man?" Mr. Larkspur nodded. "Julian Marlowe, the greatest violinist who ever played at the Arcadia. He vanished from the theater 20 years ago." "Vanished?" "During a performance." Holmes sat forward. "Now we are improving. Tell me everything." Mr. Larkspur drew a breath and began. "Julian Marlowe was not merely a musician. He was a sensation. In the winter of 1871, people came from all over London to hear him play. He had a gift that seemed almost unnatural. Even those who knew nothing of music said that when Marlowe played, they remembered things they had forgotten." "A dangerous talent," said Holmes softly. "He was engaged to perform for 6 weeks at the Arcadia. The theater was full every night. On the final evening he was to play a new composition called The Glass Nocturne. He had written it himself. No one had heard the complete piece before, and on that evening he vanished. Yes, he played the first movement. Then, during the interval, he returned to his dressing room. The door was locked from within. When the stage manager called him for the second half, there was no answer. They forced the door, and the room was empty. Windows locked from within. Fireplace sealed. Other doors? None. And the violin? Gone. Holmes's gaze had become very still. What else was found? A chair overturned. A broken mirror. A small pool of water on the floor. Water? Yes. Interesting. And on the dressing table, a silver tuning key. It had belonged to Marlowe. He wore it on a chain around his neck. Holmes tapped his fingers together. Was the body ever recovered? No. Was he presumed dead? Eventually. Was foul play suspected? Of course, there were rumors. There are always rumors in a theater. What kind, Mr. Larkspur looked uneasy. That another violinist envied him. That a patron had threatened him. That a woman loved him. That he was in debt. That he had sold his soul to the devil. The devil seldom needs legal assistance, Holmes said. The woman, the rival, the patron, and the debt are more promising. Who owns the Arcadia now? I do. You inherited it. From my uncle, Mr. Bartholomew Larkspur. He was manager at the time of Marlowe's disappearance. Ah. The little syllable was quiet, but I knew Holmes well enough to hear its significance. Mr. Larkspur continued. My uncle kept Marlowe's dressing room locked after the disappearance. He said it was out of respect. When I took over the property, I left it much as it was. There was never money to reopen the theater properly. But I have lately received an offer from a developer who wishes to purchase the building and demolish it. And then the music began. Yes. Before or after the offer? After. Holmes smiled faintly. London ghosts are often opposed to redevelopment. It is one of their more practical qualities. Mr. Larkspur gave a strained look. You think this is a trick? I think someone wishes you to think it is not. The manager leaned forward. Mr. Holmes, I am not a superstitious man. I have spent my life backstage. I know trapdoors, wires, false walls, and mechanical thunder. I know how illusions are made, but I swear to you, I have heard that violin in empty rooms where no living hand could have played it. Holmes stood and reached for his coat. Then we must go and listen. Mr. Larkspur stared. Tonight? Certainly. It is not yet 11. He turned to me. Watson, your revolver? Is it likely to be needed? No. But theatrical people appreciate props. Within 15 minutes, we were in a cab, making our way through the wet streets toward Wych Street. London at night has many faces. There is the bright London of theaters, clubs, and restaurants. There is the poor London of alleys, market carts, and tired figures moving beneath shawls. And there is the hidden London that appears only when the fog descends, when the lamps become blurred circles of amber light, and when the city seems less built than dreamed. That was the London through which we rode. Holmes sat opposite me, silent and alert. Mr. Larkspur, beside him, stared out into the rain. The cab turned at last into a narrow street where many of the buildings appeared half asleep. There were shuttered shops, a public house with one dim light still burning, and at the far end, set back behind iron railings, the Arcadia Theatre. It was a melancholy building. The facade had once been handsome, with carved masks above the entrance and faded gilding around the name. But years of weather had darkened the stone. Posters from old productions peeled in the frames. The ticket windows were dusty. The great doors stood closed beneath a canopy where rain dripped steadily from the edges. Mr. Larkspur unlocked a side entrance. We stepped inside. The air smelled of dust, damp velvet, old wood, and extinguished lamps. He carried a lantern ahead of us. The narrow passage opened into the main lobby. Even neglected, the theater retained a kind of faded elegance. Marble pillars stood beneath cracked plaster. Red carpets, worn almost black in places, ran toward the auditorium doors. Above us hung a chandelier covered in dust sheets. The mirrors along the walls reflected our lantern light in long, uncertain strips. A sleeping palace, I said. Holmes glanced round, or a stage waiting for its next lie. Mr. Larkspur led us into the auditorium. The sight that met us was extraordinary. Rows of empty seats curved away into darkness. The gallery hung above like a shadowed cliff. The stage curtain, once crimson, had faded to a deep brown red. Gold decoration clung in patches around the boxes. The orchestra pit was covered with boards. Everywhere lay a fine gray layer of dust. And yet, as we stood there, I had the strange impression that the theater had not been empty a moment before. It felt as though an audience had just vanished. Holmes took the lantern from Mr. Larkspur and walked slowly down the aisle. I followed, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. Where were you standing when you heard the music last night? Holmes asked. In the rear of the stalls. And it came from? The stage. Holmes climbed the steps to the stage. He lifted the lantern high. The boards were dusty, but not uniformly so. There were marks near center stage. Not footprints exactly, but places where the dust had been disturbed. Holmes knelt. Someone has stood here recently. Mr. Larkspur's stiffened. Impossible. Few words are less useful. He examined the stage floor, then moved toward the wings. Who has keys to the theater? Myself, Mr. Finch, the caretaker, and Mr. Alden Creed, my solicitor, though he has not used his in years. No one else? No former employees? None living nearby. Musicians? The Arcadia has had no musicians for a decade. Holmes moved behind the curtain and into the backstage area. Here the theater became a different creature. The public rooms were faded but graceful. Backstage was narrow, dusty, and tangled with ropes, pulleys, ladders, props, and old flats painted to resemble forests, drawing rooms as castles and moonlit gardens. The dressing rooms lay along a corridor behind the stage. Mr. Larkspur stopped before one door. Marlowe's room. The door was locked. The key turned with difficulty. Inside, the room was small but carefully preserved. A narrow couch stood against one wall. A dressing table with a cracked mirror stood opposite. A chair lay overturned in the corner, as if no one had dared to right it in 20 years. A faded rug covered the floor. There was one window, high and narrow, overlooking a blind alley. Holmes entered first. I followed with a curious sensation, as though stepping into a memory. Everything seemed suspended. The brushes on the dressing table. The empty glass. The old playbill pinned beside the mirror. The water stain on the floorboards. Holmes went first to the window. "Locked," he said. He examined the latch, then the frame, then the dust beneath. No recent opening. He crossed to the dressing table. "Where was the tuning key found?" "There," said Mr. Larkspur, pointing to the center of the table. Holmes looked at the cracked mirror. The break ran diagonally from the upper corner to the lower edge. Not shattered. Struck once, perhaps by a hard object. What was behind the mirror in 1871? Behind it? Yes. The wall, I suppose. Holmes gently touched the mirror frame. It moved. Mr. Larkspur gasped. Holmes pulled it outward. The mirror swung open on small hinges. Behind it was a shallow recess in the wall. Empty. "Did you know of this?" Holmes asked. "No." Holmes looked pleased. "Then our ghost has already become more useful than most." Inside the recess, there was dust, but not as much as there should have been. Something had rested there for a long time and had been removed recently. Holmes leaned closer and sniffed. "Rosin? Violin rosin?" I asked. "Yes, and something else." He brushed the wood with his finger. "Salt. Salt? Sea salt, unless my nose deceives me." Mr. Larkspur stared at him. "What could sea salt have to do with a London theatre?" "That is one of the questions, Mr. Larkspur." At that moment, from somewhere beyond the walls, a sound came. One note. Soft, high, and clear. We all froze. A second note followed. Then a third. The sound of a violin. It was distant but unmistakable. The melody rose slowly, delicate and melancholy, as though someone were playing in another part of the building. Mr. Larkspur's face drained of color. "There," he whispered. "There it is." Holmes held up a hand. The music continued. It was unlike any street tune I had heard. It moved gently, almost hesitantly, with a sadness that made the dusty dressing room seem suddenly full of unseen listeners. Holmes closed his eyes. "Not from the stage," he murmured. "No," I said. "Above us." "The gallery," said Mr. Larkspur. Holmes opened his eyes. "Come." We hurried out into the corridor, through the wings, and up a narrow staircase that led toward the gallery. The music continued as we climbed. At the top, the sound seemed nearer. We emerged into the upper gallery, where rows of seats disappeared into darkness beneath the curved ceiling. The violin played from the far end. Holmes moved quickly but quietly between the rows. I followed, revolver in hand. The music grew louder. Then, just as we reached the place from which it seemed to come, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost startling. Holmes lifted the lantern. There was no one there. Only empty seats, dust, and a single object lying upon the floor. Holmes picked it up. It was a silver tuning key. Mr. Larkspur swayed. "That is Marlowe's." Holmes held it to the light. "Are you certain?" "Yes, I saw it once in my uncle's collection. He kept it locked in a case after Marlowe vanished." "Where is that case now?" "In my office." "Is it secure?" "Yes." "Then we shall examine it." Before returning downstairs, Holmes inspected the gallery carefully. He found no violin, no musician, no open door, and no footprints except our own. Yet near the far wall, beneath a torn patch of wallpaper, he found a thin line in the plaster. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He tapped it. A hollow sound answered. Holmes smiled. "The Arcadia continues to improve." We returned to the manager's office, a small room beside the lobby. Mr. Larkspur unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a glass display case. Inside were several objects connected with the theater's history. A laurel crown, an ivory fan, an actor's ring, a playbill, and a small velvet space where something had clearly been removed. "The key was there," he said. "Was the case locked?" "Yes." "Who has the key?" "I do." He produced it. Holmes examined the lock. No force, no scratches. It was opened properly. "But no one else has the key." Holmes glanced at him. "Sir, my dear sir, when a man says no one else has the key, he usually means no one else has the key with his permission." Mr. Larkspur sank into a chair. "You think someone in the theater is doing this?" "I think someone is using the theater." "But why?" Holmes placed the tuning key on the desk. "Because the building is about to be sold. Because Julian Marlowe vanished here. Because a secret has slept inside these walls for 20 years. And because someone has decided that sleep has lasted long enough." The rain continued outside. The theater creaked around us. It was nearly 1 in the morning when Holmes completed his first inspection. He asked Mr. Larkspur for permission to keep the silver tuning key overnight, which the manager granted with visible reluctance. Then we returned to Baker Street through the misty streets. Holmes was in excellent spirits. A locked dressing room, a vanished musician, a hidden recess, a stolen relic, a theater full of passages, salt, rosin, and music from empty air. My dear Watson, London has apologized for its dullness. You have a theory? I have several. Most are wrong. One hopes one of them will become ashamed and leave. The next morning, I found Holmes already at breakfast with the silver tuning key beside his plate. He had polished a small area of it and was examining the surface through his lens. Observe, Watson. I leaned over. The tuning key was beautifully made, with a tiny engraving of a bird on one side and the initials J.M. on the other. What do you see? A silver key, engraved. What else? I looked closer. There are scratches near the handle. Good. And perhaps something caught in the engraving. Holmes nodded. Wax, dark blue wax. Sealing wax, possibly. Or theatrical wax used for securing stage fittings. But note this. He turned the key. The metal is worn in a way that suggests it has been used recently, not merely kept in a display case. To tune a violin or to open something, a tuning key is a key, Holmes smiled. Names are not always functions, Watson. After breakfast, Holmes sent 3 telegrams, one to a music historian in Kensington, one to a retired stage carpenter in Lambeth, one to a shipping clerk at the London docks. Then he spent the late morning searching old newspapers. By noon, the sitting room was filled with clippings, notes, and the smell of tobacco smoke. Here we are, he said at last. Julian Marlowe, born in Bath, trained in Vienna, performed in Paris, returned to London in 1870. A genius, according to some, difficult according to others. Engaged to perform at the Arcadia in 1871. Vanished January 23rd. Any mention of enemies? Several. A rival violinist named Anton Voss, whose career declined as Marlowe's rose. A wealthy patron, Lady Emmeline Calder, who was rumored to be overly fond of him. A stagehand, dismissed after a quarrel. And one more interesting fact. What is that? Marlowe was to leave London the day after his final performance. For where? America? Alone? Holmes tapped the newspaper. That is the question. A notice in a society paper suggests that a young woman named Rose Bellamy, daughter of a theatrical costumer, disappeared the same week. With Marlowe? Possibly. Or because of him. Or because someone wished people to think so. Was she connected to the Arcadia? Her father supplied costumes there for 15 years. Holmes leaned back. There is also this, from the shipping records. A violin case belonging to Julian Marlowe was found aboard a steamer bound for New York 2 days after he vanished. Then he escaped. Did he? The case was on the ship. But was he? I frowned. No body, no witness, and no violin. Precisely. At 12:30, Mrs. Hudson brought up a visitor, Mr. Silas Finch, the caretaker of the Arcadia Theatre, was a stooped man with a heavy brow, a gray beard, and hands marked by years of work. He wore a rough coat, and his boots left damp prints near the door until Mrs. Hudson gave them such a look that he stepped hastily onto the mat. Holmes had sent for him. You are Mr. Finch. Aye. You have worked at the Arcadia long. 31 years. Then you knew Julian Marlowe. Finch's face closed. I saw him. That is not the same thing. No, sir. Holmes motioned for him to sit. Finch sat awkwardly on the edge of the chair. You were present the night Marlowe vanished? I was a young scene shifter then. What do you remember? The caretaker looked at the fire. I remember the audience would not stop clapping after the first part. I remember Mr. Marlowe walking off stage as pale as a sheet. I remember Mr. Larkspur, the old one, following him backstage. I remember shouting from the dressing room. Between Marlowe and Bartholomew Larkspur? Aye. What words? Finch hesitated. Holmes's voice softened. Mr. Finch, a secret that has survived 20 years has grown old enough to become dangerous. The caretaker sighed. I heard Marlowe say, I will not leave her behind. Then Mr. Larkspur said, you will ruin us all. Her being Rose Bellamy? Finch looked up sharply. So you know. I know names, not truth. Finch rubbed his hands together. Rose was a good girl, quiet, worked in the costume rooms with her father. Marlowe loved her. or said he did. They were going to run away after the final performance. And Larkspur objected. Larkspur objected to anything he could not sell tickets for. Why would Marlowe running away ruin them all? Finch looked down again. Because of the violin. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Ah, tell me, it was not his. Marlowe's violin? No, sir. It belonged to Lady Calder. A Stradivarius, they said. Worth more than the theater. She lent it to him for the season. And he planned to take it to America. That was the rumor. Was Lady Calder aware? I do not know. But Mr. Larkspur was afraid. If Marlowe vanished with that violin, the theater would be ruined. And on the night he vanished, the violin vanished with him. Holmes looked toward me. The matter gained strings. Finch shifted. There is more. Holmes waited. Rose did not vanish the same night. No. She was in the theater after Marlowe disappeared. I saw her near the stage door crying. She had a small parcel in her hands. What kind of parcel? Long and narrow. A violin case, maybe. And then I was sent to fetch a constable. When I returned, she was gone. Did you tell the police? I told Mr. Larkspur. The old Mr. Larkspur? Yes, and he said I must have been confused. Holmes smiled without warmth. Managers have a talent for improving reality. After that, Rose was said to have run away. Her father left London within a month. Where did he go? Dover, I heard. Holmes's fingers tapped the arm of his chair. Have you heard the violin this week, Mr. Finch? Finch's face changed. Yes. And what do you think it is? The old caretaker looked toward the rain-streaked window. I think someone is asking to be remembered. After Finch left, Holmes remained thoughtful. Dover, he said. The sea salt, I replied. Exactly. You think Rose Bellamy went to Dover? Perhaps. Or her father did. Or the violin did. Or all three. A telegram arrived at 2 o'clock. Holmes read it and smiled. My music historian confirms that Lady Emmeline Calder owned a Stradivarius known as the Nightingale. It disappeared in 1871 after being lent to Julian Marlowe. Insurance was paid after a bitter legal dispute. So the violin was worth a fortune. Worth murder, certainly. Another telegram arrived at 3. This one caused Holmes to laugh softly. From our stage carpenter. The Arcadia possesses a disused speaking tube system and several acoustic ducts built during the 1868 renovation. Sound from one room could be made to appear in another if the proper openings were known. The ghostly violin. Not ghostly. Directed. Then someone played it elsewhere in the theater. Or played a device. Or used a recording cylinder, though the sound we heard seemed too clear for that. And the hollow wall in the gallery, likely one of the ducts. The third telegram arrived shortly after 4. Holmes read it twice. Well, Watson, we go to Dover. Tonight? No, tomorrow. Tonight we return to the Arcadia. At 10 o'clock that evening, we again entered the old theater. This time Holmes had arranged for Mr. Larkspur, Finch, and a constable to remain in the lobby while he and I inspected the stage alone. Why not have them with us? I asked. Because one of them may be more useful when he believes he is unobserved. You suspect Larkspur? I suspect everyone whose life touches the theater. That includes the constable if he has bought a ticket. Holmes smiled. We entered Marlowe's dressing room. Holmes went at once to the hidden recess behind the mirror. He examined the back and sides with his lens, then pressed the lower edge. A small panel slid loose. Inside was a narrow channel that disappeared downward into the wall. Watson, hand me the candle. I did. He held the flame near the opening. It flickered inward. A current of air. A passage, too small for a man. Large enough for sound. Possibly large enough for an object attached to a cord. He reached into his coat and withdrew a thin wire with a hook at the end. He lowered it carefully into the channel. After a moment, it caught. He pulled. Something scraped inside the wall. Then a small object emerged. It was a fragment of black ribbon. Holmes held it up. Old. Silk. A lady's ribbon, I should say. Rose Bellamy? Perhaps. He placed it in an envelope. Then he examined the water stain on the floor. This stain has been misdescribed. As water? It was water, but mixed with something. He scraped a little residue from between the boards. Salt again. Seawater? Or melted ice from a container packed in salt. For preserving something, or transporting something. Before I could ask more, music began. This time it came not from above, but from beneath us. The violin's melody rose through the floorboards, soft and sorrowful. Holmes's face became intent. The pit. We hurried to the stage and down into the orchestra pit. The music seemed to come from the darkness beneath the boards. Holmes lifted the trapdoor that led to the storage area below the stage. The sound grew louder. We descended. The space beneath the stage was low and crowded with old scenery, rolled carpets, wooden frames, broken chairs, and painted clouds. The melody floated through it like a living thing. Holmes held up the lantern. At the far end, a door stood open. I was told all lower passages were sealed, he said. They appear to have changed their mind. We crossed the storage area and entered a narrow brick passage. The music came from ahead. At last we reached a small chamber beneath the stage. In its center stood a mechanical device, a cylinder, a bowing mechanism, and a set of tightened strings fixed to a wooden frame. It was not a violin. It was a machine built to imitate one. The bow moved steadily across the strings, driven by clockwork. The melody continued until the mechanism slowed, trembled, and stopped. I stared in astonishment. Who could have built such a thing? A skilled mechanic with musical knowledge, Holmes said. He bent over the machine. Recently oiled, recently wound, ingenious, but not new. Parts date back at least 20 years. On the table beside the machine lay a card. Holmes picked it up. Written upon it in neat black ink were the words, "Ask what happened before the interval." Holmes's eyes brightened. Not after. Before. What does it mean? It means, Watson, that the important event did not occur when Marlowe vanished. It occurred while the audience still believed him to be playing. We returned to the lobby. Mr. Larkspur was pale. "You found the source?" "A source," said Holmes. The manager looked relieved. Then it was a trick. It was a message. Finch, standing near the door, closed his eyes. Holmes turned to him. "Mr. Finch, during the first movement of the Glass Nocturne, did Marlowe leave the stage?" "No." "Are you certain?" Finch hesitated. "I was backstage." "That does not answer the question." The old caretaker looked at the floor. There was a moment when the lights failed. Holmes spoke very softly. "Tell me." It was during the first movement. The gas jets flickered. Not completely out, but low. The stage went dark for perhaps half a minute. "And the violin continued?" "Yes." "Did you see Marlowe when the lights rose?" "I thought I did." "You thought?" "He stood in the same place, playing." Holmes turned to Larkspur. "Was your uncle present backstage?" "Yes. He often was." "And Rose Bellamy?" "I do not know." Holmes looked from one man to the other. "Gentlemen, I believe Julian Marlowe disappeared before the interval." Mr. Larkspur looked bewildered, but the audience saw him finish the movement. They saw a man finish the movement. Finch whispered, "Voss." Holmes turned. Anton Voss, the rival violinist. "He could imitate Marlowe's posture," Finch said. "Everyone said so. He mocked him backstage, the way he held his bow, the way he bowed to the audience." "And he was present that night?" "Yes, he had come to watch." Mr. Larkspur shook his head. "But why?" Holmes placed the card on the table. "That is what we shall ask in Dover." The next morning, Holmes and I took the train to Dover under a sky washed pale by rain. Holmes had discovered that Rose Bellamy's father, Elias Bellamy, had lived in Dover after leaving London and had died there 5 years earlier. His daughter, however, was still alive. She lived under the name Mrs. Rose Harcourt in a small cottage above the harbor. We found her in the afternoon. She was a woman in her late 40s, with silver in her dark hair and a face that must once have been very beautiful. She received us in a small parlor overlooking the sea. On the mantel were shells, a framed needlework sampler, and a vase of dried lavender. When Holmes gave his name, she did not appear surprised. "I wondered when someone would come," she said. "You know why we are here? The Arcadia?" "Yes." She looked toward the window. "The past has begun playing again, has it?" Holmes sat opposite her. "Mrs. Harcourt, I must ask you about Julian Marlowe." She folded her hands in her lap. "I loved him." The simplicity of the answer silenced the room. "He intended to leave London with you?" "Yes, with Lady Calder's violin." Her face tightened. "No," Holmes waited. "Julian was many things, Mr. Holmes. Proud, vain at times, reckless. But he would not steal a violin. He was accused because it was convenient." "Then what happened?" She closed her eyes. The night of the final performance, Julian came to me before the curtain rose. He was frightened. I had never seen him frightened before. Of whom? Bartholomew Larkspur. The manager? Yes. Julian had discovered that Larkspur had insured the theater heavily and intended to arrange a fire after closing. Not a blaze that would kill anyone, he said. Just enough damage to collect the money and blame faulty gas fittings. Larkspur meant to commit fraud. Yes. Julian threatened to expose him. Larkspur threatened to ruin Julian with accusations about the violin. There was an argument. Before the performance? Yes. What happened during the first movement? Mrs. Harcourt looked down. The lights dimmed. It was arranged. In that darkness, Larkspur's men seized Julian and dragged him backstage. Anton Voss took his place and played the final portion. Voss was part of it. He wanted Julian disgraced. He thought if Julian disappeared with the violin, people would call him a thief and coward. Voss would take his engagements. And Julian? He was brought to the dressing room. I was waiting nearby with his coat. I heard the struggle. I ran in. She paused. Julian was alive then. Yes, injured but alive. Larkspur was there. Voss was there. Another man too, a stagehand I did not know. They wanted the violin. Julian had hidden it. Where? In the secret recess behind the mirror. Holmes nodded. And then? Julian tried to escape. Voss struck him with a glass bottle. He fell. His head hit the corner of the dressing table. Her voice grew faint. There was so much silence after. I saw her hands tremble. Holmes spoke gently. He died? Yes. And the water stain? Larkspur had ordered ice brought in, packed with salt, to prepare for the fire trick. They used it to cool the body, to delay signs of death, I think. I do not know. Everything became confused. What happened to the body? She looked toward the sea. They carried him through the lower passage to a delivery cart. I followed. You followed? I had the violin. Julian had told me where it was. When they left the room, I took it from the recess. I thought if they had his body and the violin, they would make him a thief forever. So you hid it. I took it to my father. We fled to Dover that night. And Julian's body, she closed her eyes, thrown into the sea from a cargo boat. My father had a cousin at the docks who later told him. Holmes was silent for some time. And why did you never speak? Who would believe a costumer's daughter against Bartholomew Larkspur, Anton Voss, and Lady Calder's lawyers? And I had the violin. If I came forward, they would say I had stolen it. Where is the Nightingale now? Mrs. Harcourt rose slowly. She crossed to a cabinet, opened it, and removed a long case wrapped in dark cloth. She placed it upon the table. Inside lay a violin. Even I, who knew little of such instruments, could see that it was extraordinary. The wood glowed warmly, even in the gray afternoon light, and the curves of it seemed alive. Holmes did not touch it. The Nightingale, he said. Yes. Why keep it? Because it was the only grave Julian had. Holmes bowed his head slightly. And the music now? Mrs. Harcourt looked at him steadily. My son. Your son? Julian's son. He is a mechanic. A musician too, though he would deny it. He went to London when he heard the Arcadia was to be demolished. He said if the building fell, Julian's name would be buried forever. He built the violin machine. Yes, from Julian's old sketches. Julian loved mechanical instruments. Your son's name, Matthew. Is he dangerous? No, but grief can become foolish when inherited. Holmes stood. Mrs. Harcourt, your silence protected you once. It now protects the guilty dead and endangers the living. I ask you to come with me to London. She looked at the violin. And the Nightingale? Bring it. That evening, we returned to London with Mrs. Harcourt and the violin. Holmes sent messages ahead. By the time we reached the Arcadia, Mr. Larkspur, Finch, a constable, and a nervous young man of about 20 with dark hair and clever hands were waiting in the lobby. When Mrs. Harcourt saw the young man, she said only, Matthew. He lowered his head. Holmes looked at him. You arranged the music. Yes. You stole the tuning key from the display case. Yes, with a duplicate key. My grandfather had made one years ago. You placed the cards. Yes, you intended to frighten Mr. Larkspur into delaying the sale. Matthew looked up. I intended people to ask questions. You succeeded. Mr. Larkspur stared from one face to another. What is this? What is happening? Holmes walked to the center of the lobby. "What is happening, Mr. Larkspur, is that the Arcadia Theatre is giving its final performance." He asked that we all follow him into the auditorium. There, beneath the dusty chandelier and the empty gallery, Mrs. Harcourt opened the violin case. She lifted the nightingale with reverent care. Matthew handed her the bow. "I have not played in many years," she said. "You need not play well," Holmes replied. "Only truly." She stood upon the stage where Julian Marlowe had last been seen alive. For a moment, no one breathed. Then she began to play. The music was soft at first, unsteady, then fuller. It filled the empty theater slowly, reaching the gallery, the boxes, the dark rows of seats. It was the same melody we had heard from the machine, but now it had breath within it. It was not the sound of a haunting. It was the sound of someone speaking after too long a silence. Finch wept openly. Mr. Larkspur sat down as if his legs had failed him. Matthew stood very still. Holmes watched from the aisle, his face unreadable. When the final note faded, the theater seemed less empty than before. Mrs. Harcourt lowered the bow. "That was the glass nocturne," she said. Holmes turned to Mr. Larkspur. "Your uncle murdered Julian Marlowe with the assistance of Anton Voss and at least one stagehand. He concealed the death and created the appearance of disappearance in order to protect himself from exposure. He later profited from insurance fraud in connection with the theater's decline. The violin, believed stolen, was in fact preserved by the woman who loved Marlowe." Mr. Larkspur's voice shook. "I knew nothing. I believe you, but your uncle's papers may know more than you do. They are in storage. Then we shall read them." Over the following days, the truth emerged in fragments, as truth often does. In Bartholomew Larkspur's old ledgers, Holmes found payments made to Anton Voss and a stagehand named Grimes, who had died some years before. He found coded references to repairs never made and insurance claims filed under suspicious circumstances. He found a letter from Lady Calder accusing Larkspur of deception, and another from Larkspur threatening to expose Rose Bellamy as a thief if she ever spoke. Anton Voss, still living but bedridden in a poor quarter near Islington, confessed when Holmes confronted him. He had not meant, he said, for Marlowe to die. He had only meant to frighten him, disgrace him, and take his place. Holmes listened without pity. Men who claim they meant only to ruin a life are often surprised when death walks in through the door they opened. As for the Arcadia, the sale was delayed. There was talk of preserving the theater, or at least part of it. Mr. Larkspur, who had inherited more guilt than profit, seemed shaken into decency. He offered to place a memorial plaque near the stage. Mrs. Harcourt agreed on one condition. Julian Marlowe's name would not be followed by the word vanished. It would say murdered. It would say musician. It would say beloved. The nightingale was returned, after legal negotiation, not to Lady Calder, who had long since died, but to a musical foundation established in Marlowe's name. Matthew Harcourt was not prosecuted. Holmes spoke privately with Mr. Larkspur and the constable, and the matter of the staged haunting was considered a misguided attempt to reveal a crime rather than conceal one. "I suppose," I said to Holmes later, "that is not strictly legal. My dear Watson, legality is a map. Justice is the country. The two do not always resemble one another." It was a week after our first visit that Holmes and I returned alone to the Arcadia. The theater was quiet. Dust still lay upon the seats. The curtain still hung faded above the stage, but the air felt changed. Holmes walked to the center aisle and looked toward the stage. "No music tonight," I said. "No. Does that disappoint you?" "On the contrary. A ghost that knows when to retire is a rare and admirable thing." We stood for a moment in silence. Then Holmes took from his pocket the silver tuning key. Mr. Larkspur had asked him to place it in the theater's new memorial case. Holmes turned it once in his hand. "A small object," he said. "Yes. And yet it opened 20 years. He walked to the stage and set it carefully upon a cloth where the memorial items were being gathered. A playbill, a photograph of Marlowe, a copy of the glass, nocturne, and a single black silk ribbon. Rose Bellamy's ribbon, the one we had found hidden in the wall. Holmes looked at it for some time. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "That music is a dangerous archive." "In what way?" "Paper may burn, witnesses may lie, bodies may vanish. but a melody can live in a human mind for half a lifetime and return with its accusation intact. You are becoming poetic. It is the theater. It infects the air. I smiled. We left by the side door. Outside, Wych Street shone with rain. London moved quietly around us, lamps glowing, wheels passing, footsteps fading into the mist. As we rode back to Baker Street, Holmes said little. When we arrived, Mrs. Hudson had left a fire burning. The room welcomed us with its familiar warmth. Holmes took up his violin from the corner and, without removing his coat, played a few soft notes. I recognized the melody, the Glass Nocturne. It sounded different in our sitting room, less sorrowful, more peaceful. Perhaps because the secret had been spoken. Perhaps because the dead man had at last been allowed to finish his performance. Holmes played only a minute, then lowered the bow. Enough, he said. Why stop? Because some melodies should not be owned by those who merely solve them. He placed the violin aside and sat by the fire. The rain continued against the windows. I opened my notebook. You intend me to write this one? Eventually. And what shall I call it? Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes. The public likes ghosts. Give them one. But it was not a ghost. No, it was better. Better? It was memory with evidence. I considered this the case of the Midnight Violin. Holmes opened one eye. Not terrible, Watson. From him, that was praise. And so I record it now, many years later, as the case of the Midnight Violin. Not because a phantom played beneath the stage of the Arcadia Theatre. Not because a vanished musician returned from the dead. Not because a silver tuning key appeared in an empty gallery. But because, for 1 week in London, a forgotten melody moved through an old theatre and asked the living to listen. And in the end, that was all the case required. Someone had to listen. Someone had to hear the notes behind the notes. Someone had to understand that the most persistent hauntings are not made of spirits, but of unfinished truth. The Arcadia did not become a grand theatre again, not in the way Mr. Larkspur once hoped. But its stage was restored for small concerts, and each winter a young violinist played the Glass Nocturne beneath a single golden lamp. People came to hear it. Some knew the story. Most did not. But I am told that even those who knew nothing of Julian Marlowe or Rose Bellamy often left the theatre quieter than they entered. That, perhaps, is the mark of certain music. It finds the locked rooms within us. It opens them gently, and it leaves the door ajar. As for Sherlock Holmes, he spoke of the matter only once afterward. It was late, and the fire was nearly out. London was sleeping beneath a winter fog, and Holmes had been turning the silver tuning key over in his fingers. Mr. Larkspur had sent him a replica as thanks. Watson, he said, do you know why I prefer the violin to the piano? I am afraid I do not. The piano tells you where every note waits. The violin asks you to find it. And you prefer the search. Always. He smiled faintly and set the little key upon the mantel. Outside, the rain softened. The lamps of Baker Street glowed through the mist, and somewhere in the quiet of London, perhaps in an old theatre, perhaps only in memory, a violin seemed to play the first few notes of a song that had waited 20 years to be heard. Now the theatre is dark. The case is closed. The rain has settled over London, and the melody has drifted gently into silence. So close your eyes now. Let the old city fade into the night. Let the fire burn softly in the room. Let the music of the Midnight Violin carry you slowly and peacefully towards sleep. These are the stories that tuck you in,